Well, welcome everybody, and it's so nice that it's the first, like it's really light outside here in Guelph, so this is great, and we're thrilled to have everyone here. And Colin, you can go on the next slide, but I'll just say, because we have announced class announcements, I'll just say a few things. For the students, you can remember that the draft, which is optional, is due on Friday. So if you want your TAs to read the draft of your final essay for comments, then you have to give it a And then the other thing is that tonight and next week are the last two of the short weekly assignments. So you'll have one again tonight and one next week. And remember that we count 6 out of the 10 best. And we are already looking for the last class. We'll announce what it is next week, because it was to be determined. So, but we're building that panel, and it's going to be about looking back at the year, looking forward for universities in particular in terms of teaching. And I think it's going to be a fun class as well. So we'll start with our presentations, and as usual, we will use the Zoom chat as the function. So when you have questions, you just type them in the chat. And Ryan and I will do our best to ask as many or combine as many or get inspired by your questions. And we'll see. I'm looking forward to tonight. So next slide.
Okay, so as usual, we'll introduce the panelists one at a time, and they'll give us their introductory comments. And we'll save the questions for once we've seen what you've heard from all of them. And just for the panelists, it depends, it's up to you, but sometimes people will find that they want to respond to questions directly in the chat. You're welcome to do that. We'll be trying to ask as many of them or put them together into combined questions as we can for actually discussing. But sometimes people, if there's sort of detailed questions or, what did you say about X, Y, or Z, you're welcome to type in the chat as well at any point. So let's start. I'll introduce Andrew Bailey. He's an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy and also the Associate Dean Research and Graduate of Arts. His work deals with the philosophy of mind and addresses the place and role of phenomenal consciousness in the physical world, and in particular, its potential applications in psychology and medicine. He's also interested in the social and ethical consequences of AI technology, employment patterns, privacy, security, fairness, and even existential threats to humanity. Very importantly, he uses zombies as a philosophical thought experiment to discuss consciousness. So as a big zombie fan, I'm actually quite fascinated by this. And in 2020, Dr. Bailey received a COVID-19 Catalyst Fund for his project Framework for an Ethical and Effective System of Immunity Certification for Ontario. Andrew, it's great to have you with us tonight.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I just tried to share my screen. Did that work for everybody? Awesome. I'm really excited to be joining with this course. I've heard such good things about it. I'm really pleased to be able to participate in a humble way. I know that the other members of the conversation today are much more expert on these issues than I am, but I just wanted to introduce some social ethical themes to the discussion. I figure that that's sort of the role that I have here. I want to just quickly talk about a couple of issues very quickly. I'm supposed to just talk for 5 minutes, right? So I just wanted to talk about a couple of issues around vaccines that have ethical ramifications, and actually suggest that the whole response to the COVID pandemic is deeply and intimately tied up with social and ethical questions to do with social solidarity, to do with justice, and that questions that can look potentially at first sight purely medical, for example, actually turn out not to be purely medical, not just to be purely scientific, but actually to have a deep ethical component as well. So three aspects of thinking about vaccines that I wanted to just breeze very quickly past vaccine hesitancy, where I'm just going to introduce the work of my colleague in the philosophy department, Maya Goldenberg, who's done excellent work on this. I'm just entirely stealing all of her ideas for introducing that topic. A little bit about vaccine passports, and just to put on the table the questions to do with what I'm calling here vaccine responsibilities that cross national borders, which is something that I think we're just beginning to think about now. All three issues I'm going to try and shine the same light on, see through the same lens, which is that one way of thinking about the importance of the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the ways in which it's changed all of our lives, is that it's been a real stress test for relationships of social solidarity, both within communities and between communities. There's been a whole bunch of aspects of our response to the pandemic which have really highlighted and exacerbated existing injustices and highlighted the importance of responding to those inequities and injustices in order to make just the response to the pandemic more effective. So this is a pattern which it's a bit banal, just sort of laid out like this, but it's a pattern that we see throughout history. It's a pattern that we see all the time, and it's a pattern that we can see with COVID as well. And I guess in particular, it's a pattern that we can see when we think about vaccines with respect to COVID. So this sort of rather flat-footed schema basically says you can think of health as a good. You can think of health as something that people want, and people can do things to try and acquire more health. Right. So right now we're thinking about getting vaccinated, and also we're thinking about having all the people around you vaccinated. But of course, there's a whole bunch of different aspects to ways in which health is a good that is something that social structures are determinants of. Right. So your education level, your nutrition level, the kind of society you live in, all of those things turn health into something that you can aspire to. And in the case of goods generally, people who have power are going to take an unequal share of those goods unless there's some sort of social contract in place that will prevent them from unjustly seizing more of the goods than they're entitled to. And this is very clear, not just with respect to COVID, this is very clear when you think about health in general terms, right? So health outcomes are very much racialized. They're very much connected to income level. They're very much connected sometimes to opportunities such as educational level. So we have in some places more of a social contract, in other places less, but everywhere we can see that there are inequities where that social contract isn't strong enough. And one of the things which is interesting specifically about how this pattern shows itself with COVID is that the kind of inequality you get when the social contract isn't strong enough does a bunch of harm. And clearly it does harm to the people who aren't getting enough of the good things. It does harm to the people who are less healthy because of the social conditions in which they live, they exist. But also, as is often the case with inequality, the harms don't just redound on the people who are suffering because the powerful people are taking the good stuff. They also affect the powerful people, right? So vaccination is a interesting case of that, where if vaccine levels aren't high enough, if there's too much vaccine hesitancy, or if there are pools of the disease left in other parts of the world because vaccines aren't spread adequately across the globe, then everybody suffers, including the people who have the power. So this is a good case study where one can try and make the case that this social contract is important, even if you think of actors as self-interested, even if you think of powerful people as not caring about the less powerful. Okay, so that was all by way of just sort of setting up. I'm just going to say a little bit about each of the three topics I introduced, and then we'll subside. So vaccine hesitancy, the key thing I want to say about vaccine hesitancy, again, stealing this entirely from Maya Goldenberg's analysis. She's written a book which is just come out about vaccine hesitancy. I've got a link to that at the end of this little presentation, which I'll stick in the comments. But the key point that she makes is that vaccine hesitancy isn't a symptom of people not understanding the science. It's not a symptom of people not knowing something that we can teach them, and once they know it, they will say, "Ah, now I understand why vaccines are safe," or "Now I understand why mRNA vaccines don't change my genetic nature so that I will be, tracked by Bill Gates and all this stuff." It's not a problem of lack of knowledge or lack of understanding. People aren't distrustful of the science. What they are distrustful of is, as Maya puts it, the scientific arrangements that bring about the vaccines. They're distrustful of the people who are telling them that they should get vaccinated. And although this is a complicated question, I'm really just taking a fairly cavalierly simplistic approach to it to fit this in with my narrative here. But those questions, broadly speaking, are not unreasonable, right? People who are distrustful of big biotech companies, or they're distrustful of healthcare providers, they're distrustful of their society to look after them, often have good reason for that, right? There's a long and sad history of medical injustice that is in fact suffered by typically poor and racialized people, right? So the hesitancy can sometimes be appropriate and reasonable in the context where you haven't been given reason to trust the apparatus which is delivering the vaccines to you and telling you should take them. And the appropriate response is not to tell people more science. The appropriate response isn't to seek to educate. The appropriate response is to work on that social contract and deserve to have your vaccines be trusted because of the way in which your scientific apparatus is responding to power inequalities within society. Similar kind of line of thinking, I think, applies to vaccine passports. Okay, so vaccine passports are certifications that you have been vaccinated or potentially are otherwise immune. Maybe you've recovered from the disease, or maybe you can demonstrate your immunity in some other way. And that certification of immunity potentially allows you to do things that people who aren't thus certified can't do. So it might allow you to travel internationally, for example, or attend classes, or go to the gym, or go to movie theaters. So this, again, is a very complex issue. There's a whole bunch of aspects to it. There certainly are a bunch of medical scientific aspects about concerns about the kind of immunity that vaccines deliver. Certainly there were concerns about the kind of immunity that recovering from COVID might have delivered. But when the rubber hits the road, the real issues have turned out to be social and moral. They've turned out to do with worries about vaccine passports being discriminatory. And those worries really are that existing fault lines in society, inequalities in society, will be perpetuated by the people who get the passports versus the people who don't. You might have seen Justin Trudeau recently express concerns about that, right? Worries that endorsing vaccine passports in Canada would run the risk of contributing to these inequalities. On the other hand, if you don't do it, it looks like people are just going to act on the basis of their own self-beliefs with respect to their immunity anyway, and people are going to start behaving in ways that they think are consonant with the fact that they believe that they're immune. And it might be better to get ahead of that and have some kind of system where you can actually certify this and tell people what they can and can't do. But generally, the point here I'm just going to make is that the lens that we should look through this is social trust, right? If we could trust in our social institutions to distribute vaccines fairly and to have an appropriate level of permission for people who have vaccines versus people who don't, and to think of the whole range of society, to think of the people who are less well off, these concerns would be lower, right? So the issues around vaccine passports in the end are social ethical again. And the last thing, our vaccine responsibilities to the rest of the world. So this is a slightly dense slide here. Basically, this is just a bunch of data showing that the situation right now is quite worrisome, right? We are already in a situation where the vast majority of the available doses of vaccine have been hoovered up by Western economies, or not just Western, so Japan, Australia as well, but the richer economies around the world, leaving very little that's available for the less wealthy nations where most of the world's population live. And there are a bunch of levers that could be being used that aren't being used to try and even out that inequality. So a lot of these vaccines have been developed with large contributions from state funding bodies. Some of them depend heavily on patents, which have arisen from state research institutions like the National Institutes for Health in the US. One of the key technologies for developing the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines was developed in NIH. The patent just came up, and the US government has declined to make that patent available so that these vaccines, that technology, can be used for vaccines in the developing world, to make more available these vaccines. So again, these are social issues, these are ethical issues. I'm sure there's people here who know a lot more about these particular issues around the technology and the vaccines than I do. But again, the lens is that unless we pay attention to these inequalities, we are among the people who are going to be hurt. So the people who are in the poorer countries who are slower to get vaccinated, obviously they're going to be harmed, but also not controlling the pandemic globally is going to mean that we're not going to be out of the woods for years to come. If there's places internationally where COVID is still prevalent, it's going to keep coming back into our societies until we can control it globally. Okay, so that's probably more than my 5 minutes. So I'm going to just show you this. I'm going to try and put a PDF of these slides into the comments and otherwise distribute it so that you can look at this stuff yourself. And I'm looking forward to the other presentations. And I'm looking forward to the conversations when the presentations are done. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Andrew. There's already quite a bit of discussion happening in the chat, I have to say. I think you've raised a number of really interesting points. So I fully anticipate a very engaging discussion after we're done here. So, but as we do, we'll move on to introducing our next presenter. Kieran O'Doherty is a faculty member in the Department of Psychology, whose research focuses on a number of topics, including the social aspects of health and illness, public participation in biotechnology and science, genetic risk, the language of uncertainty, and participatory governance. He's also interested in questions of ethics, human agency, epistemology, and ontology in science and psychology. In 2020, Dr. O'Doherty received COVID-19 Catalyst funds for a project entitled Perspectives on COVID-19, Understanding Vaccine Hesitancy Among Canadians. Great to have you with us, Kieran.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Okay, so Andrew's talk is a fantastic setup for where I'm going to go with this. Andrew, are you available to talk in front of me every single presentation I do? This is
it will be an honor and a privilege, Kieran.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So in my research group, we've been focusing on a few COVID in a few different ways. And I'm drawing on work that has been done by a number of different people in my group, so I'll acknowledge them as we go. I want to highlight three kind of key messages from the work that we've done. The first thing I'll talk a little bit about is public perspectives on the COVID-19 vaccine, and specifically the importance of doing qualitative research to understand what's going on. And then the second thing that I'm working on at the moment is public trust in public health. And I'm taking a decidedly non-psychological approach to this, and maybe more of an analytical philosophy approach, to try and figure out how do we actually conceive of trust, and how does that have very important practical ramifications. And then I'm going to argue finally that what we need to do is we need to, when it comes to kind of relationships about vaccines with members of the public, we need to move away from studying publics or studying the public and instead move towards dialogue with communities. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to start off by thanking Vivian Nelson and Jenna Vixie in my research group who really did all of this work. So this is a collaborative project with York University. And in last summer, we did a series of in-depth interviews with Ontarians about their perspectives on a possible COVID vaccine. And I say possible COVID vaccine because at the time, it was very different, and of course, we also have to be very mindful of situating people's responses to where exactly in the timeline this is happening. And very, briefly, this is a plug for qualitative research, because to truly understand a perspective or someone's perspective, you need more than variables. And I'm not saying that it's not very useful to have a kind of a broad variable-based overview. Those things are very useful. But if you want to understand where somebody's coming from, how they feel about things, their hopes and concerns, you need more than that. And so we had these in-depth qualitative interviews, and I believe that our executive summary was handed out for the course. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I want to focus on just one key example that is not in the executive summary that came out of our lab meeting earlier today, and it has to do with how we can conceptualize side effects of vaccination. And if you look at official public health messaging and pamphlets and online kind of pages about this, and if you also look at how the media talks about this, side effects are talked about as fever, chills, sore arm, all of those kind of things. But when you talk to people about their concerns, their fears, and this includes people who are very pro-vaccination, I should say, that's not how they talk about side effects on the whole. In general, they talk about side effects as things that might kill you, becoming a paraplegic, like serious kind of stuff, like lasting harms. Now, why is this important? Because how we talk about vaccination, how we talk about the risks and benefits of vaccination, always includes this thing of side effects. And if we use a word that is understood differently by experts and by lay publics, we're going to run into a lot of trouble. Okay, so that's the first broad point. Let me go to the next slide, please. So I want to move now towards the idea of public trust, and I want to thank Alex Bueriu and Angela Delora, who are working on this at the moment as research interns, and I'm really building on a lot of what Andrews has said here already. So we can start off with the observation and the premise, really, that the implementation of many public health measures simply relies on public trust. I mean, unless we really coerce people to do something, all we can do really is encourage. And if I'm going to do something that somebody's encouraging me to do, there's got to be some degree of trust for me to kind of go ahead and do that. And I mean, what does this trust involve? If we look at, for example, vaccination programs, it requires trust that the vaccine is actually effective, as stated. It requires that I trust the source of the information, who's telling me that the vaccine is effective. It requires a belief in the vaccine as designed, not being harmful. So in the science that says it's not harmful, but it's not just the design of the vaccine, it's also the production and the delivery. And we know historically that a lot of harms from vaccine have come from that side of things. Not the vaccine itself was fine, but the way it was produced, the way it was handled, and so on has led to problems. So we have to trust all of those processes and people's involved in that. So there's a lot of trust that's necessary. Next slide, please. So what we did recently is we tried to look at, well, how is trust conceived of in research on COVID-19 and vaccines, but more generally as well. So for the people who have more of a philosophical bent, right? We ask questions about ontology. What kind of thing is trust? But more importantly, we ask to researchers who study trust and COVID-19, how do those researchers conceive of trust as what kind of thing? So when they measure it, when they do like a survey and a Likert scale study, what kind of thing do they think they're studying? And so we found already, this is just from the last year, about 90 studies, 90 articles that focused on trust in the context of COVID-19. So that's a lot of material in a short space of time. And on the whole, there's a little bit of variation, but these are the common things. Almost all of the studies view trust as something quantitative. So something that you either have more of or less of. They all view trust as something individual. So something that is a lot like it's with me. It's like I have trust, that's more or less. You have trust, that's more or less. So it's situated individually. And thirdly, they almost all view trust as something intrapsychic. So it exists inside. Some say it's more emotional, some say it's more cognitive, but they all view it as intrapsychic. Okay, why is this important? Because all of these articles are relatively practice oriented. They're all trying to say we want to do something helpful. So when it comes to trust, we know trust is important. We're now doing fancy studies about how trust correlates with other things. And so then the implications are, well, therefore, I now know which factors to manipulate, which variables to manipulate to get the trust level up in all of those people out there. And so this is this way of approaching trust is a very, it situates people as extremely passive, as simply things to be manipulated, to have their trust levels manipulated up and down. Next slide, please. And I saw, Andrew, in your slides, you had based on Maya's work, and I've had many conversations with Maya about this. So we're very much on the same page here, that when we talk about building trust, we're talking about genuine trust. We're talking about deserving trust. We're not talking about manipulating trust. And essentially, if all I'm doing is kind of like viewing trust as this intrapsychic thing that's out there with the individuals, and my target of intervention is all the people out there, how do I make them trust me? There's no focus on either me, whether I'm deserving of trust, and also on the relationship between us. Now, so why is that important? For exactly the reasons that Andrew's mentioned. There are many legitimate reasons why there is a not very trusting relationship between particular communities and healthcare providers, or particular communities and governments. So when there are legitimate reasons for mistrust, me saying, please trust me more, is not going to help. And I also want you to picture this. Imagine any kind of relationship you're in, maybe with a spouse or maybe a sibling, or maybe even a new boss or something like that. And that other person is doing systematic research on you, like systematic research to figure out how they can get you to trust, how to get you to trust them more. And you find out about this. How are you going to feel? You're unlikely to be more trusting towards them. On the other hand, if you feel this other person is, reflecting upon themselves and reflecting on their history with you and what they might have done wrong, that is likely to build a lot more trust. So what we need to do is we need to move away from the question of how can we get them to trust us towards the question, and I'm borrowing here from a recent paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. Warren and colleagues say, what can we do to earn and deserve increased trust? And I think that's the key thing. So as Maya and Andrew have explored already, there's a big problem with simply educating people. So the next move now is a lot of sort of smart people are no longer trying to educate, they're now trying to manipulate. Like they're trying to figure out, like, how do I get this trust? And I think that this is even worse. And really we need to move towards dialogue. And I'll go to the next slide, please. And so we need to understand individuals and communities' values, concerns, and hopes as they pertain to an issue. We also need to understand the history of the relationship that's going on. There's many things that we can do to build trust. One is allowing for direct inclusion of underrepresented groups in decision-making, key policy decision-making. And one other thing, and so this is another branch of our work that we've been doing, is we can use public deliberation. So forums for members of the public, and usually these are selected because otherwise you can't manage the conversation, of diverse members of the public to come together to genuinely be allowed to dialogue with these things, with policymakers, with scientists, and be included in setting the agenda and providing advice. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Kieran. This is really great. I'm kind of eager to get to some questions, but we have a couple of more presenters to get through here, and please keep putting your questions in the chat, everyone. It's already becoming really, really interesting. I think you've touched on Andrew and Kieran. I think you touched on a very interesting topic that is resonating very well. So let me introduce our next speaker. Leonardo Susta holds both a PhD and a DVM and is an assistant professor in the Department of Pathobiology. His research focuses on infectious avian diseases with particular emphasis on poultry and pet birds. His work spans disease surveillance, development of new diagnostic methods for infectious diseases in birds, and basic research involving avian viruses, such as Newcastle disease virus and aquatic bird Bornavirus. In 2020, Dr. Susta received COVID-19 Catalyst funds for a project entitled Development of Virus Vectored Vaccines for COVID-19. Leo, it's great to have you with us tonight.
All right, so admittedly, this was a very broad subject, so I tried to put together a few slides. These are going to be much more technical slides than the one we just went through to frame the discussion. So since we're talking about vaccination, I kind of wanted to give an overview of the landscape of different vaccines that are out there. So I'm going to start reminding everybody about the vaccination basics. So what is vaccination? Really is about training the immune system to recognize the pathogen of interest through what is called a memory response or anamnestic response. So basically, if a subject that is vaccinated comes in contact with the pathogen, is able to clear the pathogen before it actually causes damage or tissue damage. And so you can see here on this graph on the left, you see that the first time that a subject encounters a pathogen has a sort of delayed response and a very small kind of like effector magnitude of effector function, for example, either it is antibodies or T lymphocytes. But if he gets in contact with it after a few weeks, like 2 to 3 weeks, then obviously we have what is called a memory response, and the effector cells or antibodies produced in a much quicker way and a much higher magnitude. And so this is actually what we are trying to do with vaccination, and hoping that a vaccinated person that encounters SARS coronavirus 2 is able to clear it before there is the severe respiratory syndrome that characterizes the disease. So most vaccines for SARS coronavirus 2 are designed to elicit a humoral immune response, meaning an antibody response against the spike protein. Probably you guys have heard a lot about it. Why is the spike protein so important? The spike protein is very important because it actually allows the virus to attach to the cells through a receptor, which is angiotensin converting enzyme 2. And so, but for all intents and purposes, this interaction allows the virus to enter the cells. And so having specific antibodies that target the binding region of the spike protein, basically interfering in this area here, is able to inhibit the interaction between the ACE2 and the antibody, and basically inhibiting the infection. The antibodies that manage to do that are called neutralizing antibodies. To be complete, as we refine the different vaccine platform, we are not just looking for an antibody response, we are also looking for a cell-mediated response, which is mediated by lymphocytes, but really presence of antibody against the spike protein is one of the main deliverables that people look for in vaccine production against COVID-19, of course. So why do we want to vaccinate? So there is a twofold reason behind that. We want to vaccinate because people that get infected are immune. They're going to have milder or no clinical signs, and this concept is very much linked to the concept of efficacy. We want fewer people severely sick, we want fewer people in the hospital, we want to lift the pressure into the healthcare system, at the same time, of course, save lives. But at the same time, we also want to decrease the amount of shedding or transmission of virus that goes on into a population. With the assumption that vaccinated people are going to have a lower amount of virus that is transmitted between people. And so virus spread, it has been shown, and this is a long-held knowledge, the virus spread is effectively curtailed or decreased when approximately 70 to 85% of people are properly immunized. And this is so-called herd immunity that we have heard so much about. So if you look at this graph on the left, we see that in a population that is not immune, a contagious disease or infectious agent just spreads like wildfire, and everybody from blue becomes red. But in a population where we have a high proportion of vaccinated or immune people, those few infected people are not effectively able to transmit the virus throughout the population. And by doing so, in an indirect way, all the other vaccinated people are able to protect that little share of the population which is not immunized. So this is exactly what herd immunity it is. The virus does not circulate, and so in doing so, in virtue of that, we also protect that share, that part of the population that is not immune. And we cannot expect to have everybody immune at any given time. So there is going to be people that, for which, for example, the immune system doesn't work very well. So for example, the elderly, people that are immune compromised, even young people. We don't really know if there is transmission of maternal immunity between the mother and the newborn, even though we know that for younger people, COVID-19 is not a big issue. And so this is really the concept of herd immunity. Now, we have to reach a threshold of about 70%, but the WHO reports that worldwide, so not only in the wealthiest country as been said before, but worldwide, approximately only 10% of the population has got antibody for SARS coronavirus. So obviously, we still have a very long way to go. Also, the speed or the rate at which we deploy the vaccine is very important because, there has been talk about, for example, delaying prime and boost of the vaccine because we don't really have enough doses. However, there is an issue with that kind of thought because by having partially immunized people or having a large pool of non-immune people alongside a fewer vaccinated people could increase the chance of promote development of escape variant, because basically what we do, we just give a gentle selective pressure against the virus because there are still so many other people in which the virus can replicate and propagate. So we don't really have a way to assess the risk of development of escape variants. There is not really a number associated with it that we can predict. However, it is a concern, and we don't want to have deployment of vaccine drag for too long, which unfortunately doesn't seem to be the case. So what vaccines then there are out there? Many. Since the pandemic, there has been a lot of labs throughout the world that have developed prototypes or that have in their pipeline for approval a lot of different type of vaccines. So we have DNA or RNA-based vaccine, we have viral vector, different type of viral particle, or live attenuated or completely inactivated vaccines. Out of these, 1 year and a few months after 1 year from the declaration of the pandemic, we have approximately 13 vaccines that have received some degree of regulatory approval from national or more than one nation's body. And these include inactivated vaccines that are mostly being manufactured in China. We have messenger RNA vaccine, which we know is the Moderna and Pfizer, several virus vector vaccines, and we have one subunit vaccine that has been approved in Russia. However, it has not completed phase 3 clinical trials. Russia seems to have this idea of approving before complete phase 3 clinical trial. We have seen that also with the Sputnik, even though now it has been shown to be effective. So as I said before, we have a landscape of 13 vaccines that have achieved regulatory authorization. And these came through an unprecedented collaboration within the public and private partners and partnership, including academias. And there are still about 58 vaccines out there, according to different sources and vaccine trackers that can be found online. That says there are about 58 vaccines that are in preclinical and also between stage 1 and 3 clinical trials in the pipeline for approval. So obviously this pandemic has really shook the scientific community to deploy a lot of efforts and funds for this situation, unprecedented pandemic. This is a very busy table, and maybe we can talk about that later if people have questions. I tried to put together the first 7 of the 13 vaccines that have received regulatory approval, which have been approved in most countries. not by population, but just number of countries. And so we can divide those in 3 large tiers. So we have the messenger RNA vaccine, which are the latest vaccines that have been developed. Then we have virus vector vaccines. So these are vaccines where we take a virus, in this case, an adenovirus. We include the genetic material to produce the spike protein, and then we inoculate the virus. And then we have a very traditional type of vaccine that so far is being manufactured only in China. There are actually 3 vaccines in China that works this way. And those are the whole inactivated vaccines. So these are very similar to when we think about the polio vaccine. So the vaccine is grown at high titer in a bioreactor. It has to be inactivated. And then it is given usually through an adjuvant, which is some sort of substance that enhances the immune response. With a prime boost regimen of administration. One commonality about most of these vaccines is that, with the exception of CoronaVac, or the whole inactivated vaccine that kind of produce an immune response against all of the subunit of the virus, all of the other vaccines, which are some sort of recombinant vaccine, only express the spike protein, with different version, either pre-fusion stabilized or not. So all of them have the FLS, full-length spike. All of them require a prime boost dose, which is, again, is important when it comes to deployment, right? I mean, you have to, at the end, give 2 doses, and when there is scarcity or shortage of doses, that is not easily done. With the exception of the recently approved Johnson & Johnson, which has been approved for a single dose. Although right now, Johnson & Johnson has on the pipeline another vaccine that actually includes a booster with variants of concern, VOC, just to tailor the immune response against the most prevalent variant as they come along. Another good news is the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is another adenovirus vaccine, has got a lengthened period of prime boost that goes up to 12 weeks. And actually in Canada has been approved for up to 4 months. So, not all the booster shots are the same. Some of those can be delayed. One thing that, people sometimes wonder about is that, why, for example, AstraZeneca has used the chimpanzee adenovirus. That is simply because usually the adenoviruses that are used to deliver these vaccines might have a pre-existing immunity in the population because they're human adenoviruses. So by using adenoviruses from other species, we do decrease the chances there may be a pre-existing immunity and that vaccine might result ineffective because it gets cleared. And so usually people use also adenovirus 26 that, although being a human adenovirus, has got a very low prevalence, like it is present at very low rates in the general population. The messenger RNA, of course, it's very safe because it doesn't have any virus component. It's got only some genetic material. This genetic material is RNA, and so it doesn't really stay in the cells. It is easily translated into a protein, which is the full-length spike, and then is digested. So there is no really chances of integration. So there is a lot of fear or concern about that, this could make like recombinant people or something like that. There is all things out there, but really the messenger RNA gets easily destroyed within the cells and there is no concern for integration within the genome. It's also interesting to see, how these vaccines are approved. And you can see that, a lot of vaccines that are approved in China or in Russia, they're also approved in other countries that are somewhat under, I don't want to say the influence, but they have strong economic or political ties with these large political giants, whereas most of countries in Europe and in the United States and Canada, they use vaccines that they are produced either in the UK or in the USA or the Netherlands. So obviously there is also a geographical division in the way vaccines are used or deployed. Recently, Italy has decided that they would produce Sputnik 5 after it has been approved by the European Medicine Agency. And of course, that hasn't been very well received, for example, from the United States, because getting vaccine, it's also a part of how bigger country exert a degree of influence. And of course, the fact that a NATO country is going to produce a Russian vaccine might not be very well seen on the point of view of the United States. I want to leave you guys with the last slide. So this is some of the research that we are doing in the pathobiology department. So we also received seeding funds last year from the University of Guelph. And so we have a collaborative project going on between Dr. Wooten, who is another panelist here tonight, Dr. Bridle, and myself, to produce a actually COVID-19 vaccine. And we have developed a live vector vaccine that expresses the full-length spike for SARS coronavirus 2 using a virus of poultry, which is Newcastle disease virus, now called avian orthoabulavirus, but it's simpler to call it NDV. This is a respiratory virus of poultry that has been shown to be safe in people. And when we tested it in hamsters, it has been shown to be effective in protecting hamsters against challenge with SARS coronavirus 2 by decreasing the severity of pulmonary lesions and abating greatly the amount of virus that is produced upon infection. So we wanted to go this route, and now we are tailoring these against the variant that are present. And we wanted to go through the route of a respiratory virus because we wanted to, with the hypothesis of heightening the immunity that is present locally at the level of the respiratory mucosa, because that is the port of entry of the virus. So we hypothesized that by having a vaccine that is delivered through the nose or the trachea, not only we decrease or we clear the virus faster, but also we decrease the amount of virus that is transmitted in vaccinated people. So we also applied to get fundings to possibly deploy this vaccine in veterinary species, such as, for example, mix, which are infected by SARS coronavirus 2. So I realized this presentation was definitely more technical. And let me know if you have questions. I got a few additional slides about how this vaccine might function, or why they function better than others. So if you guys want a specific question, I can put up the presentation again. I've got some additional slides. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leo. That was unbelievably informative in a short time. Thank you. I think that's great. And I know we've heard obviously that just learning more about the science isn't the key necessarily to acceptance, but I think it's very useful for those of us who are eager to know how the science is progressing and how it all works. So I'm really pleased to introduce our final panelist. Sarah Wooten is an associate professor in the Department of Pathobiology. Her research focuses on engineering viruses for the purpose of understanding, preventing, treating, and curing diseases of both humans and non-human animals. Recent research projects have included gene therapy for monogenetic lung diseases like cystic fibrosis and alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, studies of retroviruses that are associated with cancers in sheep, and developing anti-cancer therapies using viruses. During the COVID-19 pandemic, she and her collaborators, as you've just heard, have adapted their work with Newcastle disease virus to develop SARS-CoV-2 vaccine candidates, 2 of which have proven to be highly efficacious in laboratory models. So I'm really pleased to have you with us as well, Sarah. Hand it over to you.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Ryan and Sophie, for inviting me to participate. I'm going to try to share my screen. So I just want to, first of all, thank you both for inviting me here to participate. And we were, Leo and I were asked to talk about vaccine development and deployment. So I think, Dr. Sesta gave a really nice overview of the various vaccine platforms that are being investigated at the moment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the regulatory path that is, oops, if I can, yes. So I've lost my animation, so I apologize for all the information that is on these slides, but it was much better when it was animated. So I'm going to first start off by talking about the path or the pipeline that vaccines need to go through in order to receive approval. So on the top here, this is a timeline that really talks about traditional vaccine development. And I'm sure you've read many articles that indicate, in a normal situation, vaccines take about 10 to 15 years before they are finally approved and are, used in humans. So I'm just going to briefly go over that just to give you an idea of what is involved in this timeline. So a lot of the initial experiments are these preclinical studies that are done in various small animal models moving up into larger animal models, including non-human primates. When this is a new pathogen, one of the first things that scientists have to do is identify protective antigens. So we need to figure out what component of the virus, I'm going to specifically talk about viruses, but this could be the case for bacteria or fungi or whatever else you need to vaccinate against. So we need to identify what proteins we need to induce an immune response against in order to develop protective immunity. So that in and of itself can take a number of years. So once a vaccine candidate has been identified and validated in an animal model, and correlates of protection have been investigated, and you now have this target vaccine that you would like to move through clinical testing. So the next steps involve process development. So you could have the best vaccine in the world, but if you can't grow it and manufacture it, it's dead in the water. So manufacturing is a really big component, and that's something that is extremely expensive and isn't something that can be done in a research facility. This also requires a lot of money. So this is where investors need to come in to fund this. And that is also tricky. Or governments can fund this step. So process development can take anywhere from 2 to 4 years. Once you have this process determined and you have your fill and finish, in other words, what buffers you're going to be, what the buffer formulation is for your final vaccine, what the storage conditions are, how long this vaccine is stable, all of these things are determined up front. Then you have this batch, which we call a GMP or good manufacturing product quality batch. You can start to do your toxicology studies. So you need to, first of all, demonstrate in animal models with the product that you intend to put into a human that there's no toxicity. So that again can take anywhere from 2 to 4 years. So after all of this work is done, then an individual or a company, whoever is promoting this vaccine, will submit an it's a investigational new drug application to the FDA, or in the case of Canada, to Health Canada. Once they have approval from this regulatory body, a number of clinical trials through different phases have to take place. So phase 1 trials, these are usually just strictly looking at safety, and they take usually 1 to 2 years and range between 20 to 100 individuals. If that vaccine is proven to be safe, then these vaccine manufacturers can move on to phase 2. And only in phase 2 are they really allowed to assess efficacy. They also are looking for safety again. And this can involve thousands of people. And then when they move to phase 3, this can involve thousands to tens of thousands of individuals. So this vaccine has to move through all those phases, and they're usually done in succession. So they usually aren't done in an overlapping manner. So again, this can take 5 to 7 years. Then licensure, so the biologics licensure is applied for, and then there's FDA or Health Canada approval. And only after this happens is the large-scale manufacturing usually implemented, because this is, of course, a very expensive part of the process, and companies are reluctant to invest in this until they know they have an approved vaccine. Okay, so this traditionally takes 10 to 15 years. Now, everybody knows that thankfully, in the case of this pandemic, this vaccine development took probably about 10 months. And it's astonishing, and it's amazing that we were able to accomplish this in such a short period of time. This probably led some people to have to question the process. Again, how can you go from 10 years to 10 months? And I'll talk about some of the reasons why that was possible. So first of all, you might remember that we had a SARS outbreak, the first SARS, in 2003. We also have the MERS coronavirus, which is another virus very similar to SARS-CoV-2. Those two, so because we had those outbreaks and we still have MERS outbreaks ongoing, a lot of the preclinical studies were already conducted. So we already knew which target antigens. So we knew that the spike protein on the surface of the coronavirus was the antigen that we needed to target to induce protective immunity. We also had tested a number of different vaccine candidates. And so a lot of that preclinical knowledge was already established. So really the discovery phase was omitted. And that's a very lengthy stage. So the other thing is some of the vaccine platforms, including the messenger RNA platforms, had already undergone process development and toxicology studies, maybe not with the goal of vaccinating against SARS-CoV-2, but mRNA vaccines were in development for cancer therapy and various other infectious diseases. And so they were able to use the toxicology studies from some of those previous experiments to, again, expedite the tox studies, and process development was already underway as well. So this IND was submitted, and the other thing that that facilitated the vaccine development was the fact that the clinical trials were somewhat overlapping. So after the interim results from the phase 1 trial, if it was deemed to be safe, then the phase 2 trial could start before the end of the phase 1 trial. And the same thing happened with phase 3 trials. So all of these trials were conducted properly. It's just that they were initiated before the results of the first trial finished. And I think we can all understand why that was necessary in this particular situation. And another huge factor in allowing us to have vaccines manufactured within 10 months is the fact that manufacturing, so this large scaling up of manufacturing, took place during the phase 3 clinical trials. And this was heavily, heavily de-risked by governments. So if a company, if a company had to fund this and scale up manufacturing before they knew that their vaccine would receive approval, this probably never would have happened. So obviously we needed to have governments back this and de-risk this manufacturing. And then of course, the regulatory, so the companies had to apply to regulatory bodies, including the FDA. So these vaccines authorization. And so that means that this is another way that the FDA and regulatory bodies can facilitate approval of drugs or vaccines, and particularly countermeasures, and it's usually in situations of public health emergency. So all of these things were expedited, but they were all done safely, just in a much faster manner. And there was a lot of money that was invested in this, and money is one of the reasons why this process is so slow. Okay, move on to the next slide. Okay, so there are immense challenges with COVID-19, with vaccine manufacturing in general. But so if you think about it, we have to make about 16 billion doses. So if everyone on Earth needs a 2-dose schedule or 2-dose regimen of a vaccine, that is a huge number of vaccines. And we've never had to do this in such a short period of time. At the time of the outbreak, there were about 200 vaccine manufacturing facilities operational worldwide, and they are making all different types of vaccines, like Dr. Sustin mentioned about the subunit vaccines, the vectored vaccines, mRNA vaccines, not so much mRNA, that's rather new, but nevertheless, they're all using different platforms. And the other issue is that the vaccines, you can't start manufacturing your vaccine until you have your fill and finish finished. So you need to know the buffers and the formulation of your vaccine before any manufacturing can begin. So there are a lot of bottlenecks. And there are many different layers to vaccine manufacturing. So if we look at this top layer, so in the very beginning, computer engineers and chemical engineers were involved in mathematical modeling to try and identify different steps in this whole vaccine production supply chain where we might encounter bottlenecks, and to try and overcome that. Then we have the human layer. So we need people, and they have to do a variety of different things in order to manufacture the vaccines. And that's a particular skill set that is not highly common. We need people to distribute the vaccines, and then ultimately we need people to administer the vaccines. So all of this human power had to be in place. And then of course we need the raw materials and the infrastructure. And one of simple things such as vialing. So normally when vaccines are produced, they're produced in vial sizes between to administer 10 to 20 doses. And that's, vials are very expensive, hard to come by, and that's not very economical when you're trying to vaccinate on a global scale. And so there are a number of agencies, including CEPI, that are trying to move towards a 200-dose bag style of vialing. So it's almost like a saline bag, if you will, rather than having these little glass vials. So all these little things have to be taken into consideration when manufacturing vaccines. And even the type of glass or the type of plastic that's used can damage vaccines. So there's just so many things. I'm glad I'm not involved in that. Okay, now we do not, you've probably read and heard a lot of people talking about how Canada does not have the capacity to develop our own vaccines, and that truly is a problem. We used to have some biomanufacturing capabilities. Primarily, we had Connaught Laboratories, which was located in Toronto. It has now sort of been annexed by the Sanofi Pasteur campus, but nevertheless, this used to be a very large biomanufacturing facility. They used to produce a variety of different types of vaccines, including diphtheria and polio vaccines. And then we had another vaccine manufacturer in Montreal called Armand Frappier, and that too has, they used to make vaccines, and that has been privatized. And this was privatized many, many years ago. These were originally labs that spun out of academic labs. They weren't managed properly, is what I understand. But in any case, they were privatized, and in that privatization, their focus and mandates were very rigid, and they have very tight production lines, so they can only make a few types of vaccines, and they have limited capacity. So really these, we really couldn't just convert these manufacturing facilities to making COVID vaccines. But thankfully, the government did see this as an issue and has invested in the National Research Council. So there is a facility that is being engineered or being built in Montreal as we speak. It's called the Good Manufacturing Practices Compliant Biologics Manufacturing Center. So the NRC, the National Research Council, has been working on process development and vaccine production for years, and they have all the skill set and all the people power to do this. The problem is they don't have a facility that is considered good manufacturing practices quality, so they can't make GMP grade vaccines for use in humans. But now with this funding from the government, this will be possible. And if you go to the website, you can see that it is being constructed, and the construction date is July 2021. So we'll see how that goes. But this is beneficial on many, many levels. So first of all, we will have our own capacity to generate and produce vaccines in this country for emergency use and also for other purposes. We should be able to supply our own vaccines and then vaccines to other countries as well. And then also, very importantly, we can start to grow our biomanufacturing capacity. This is, again, a big problem for gene therapy and oncolytic viruses, which are things that I'm also very interested in. But, at the moment, if you want to manufacture viral vectors or oncolytic viruses for use in humans, you have to use a contract manufacturing organization in the United States. And, we just need to grow this infrastructure in Canada. And I think they're seeing the light. Okay, so I'll just end with this slide talking a little bit about, or just mentioning some topics about the future for COVID-19 vaccines, because Leo's already gone over a lot of, the different types of vaccine platforms. So we talk a lot about the variants of concern. So one of the issues with our current vaccines is that they're very focused on one antigen, which is the spike protein, and for a good reason. So the spike protein is something that we need to induce that is important for neutralizing antibody induction. These vaccines are also inducing T-cell responses, but again, it's against one particular antigen. So these variants of concerns are acquiring mutations primarily in the spike protein, but also in other proteins. But these mutations in the spike protein are changing the structure of the protein to some extent, to the point that these vaccines that we are currently deploying in humans may not be able to neutralize these new variants of concern. And there's certainly evidence with the South African variant, which is difficult to inactivate, particularly with the AstraZeneca vaccine. The AstraZeneca vaccine does not work very well against the South African variant. So because of this, because these variants are circulating and they are becoming dominant strains, we need to figure out how we're going to deal with this. So we need to be able to change the vaccine administration regimen, potentially adding more boosters. I know boosters are contentious, especially because the timelines between the prime and the boost are changing, and I don't necessarily think that's a good idea. The concept of using heterologous vaccines is being investigated. So this would maybe involve an mRNA vaccine as the prime and then an adenovirus vaccine as a boost, for example. Other companies are optimizing their original vaccine platforms to encode variants of concern. and Dr. Sesta mentioned that. And then we're also thinking about second generation vaccines. So these are vaccines that are going to encode antigens other than just the spike protein. So this may include some non-structural proteins from the virus as well as the nucleocapsid protein. It just gives a broader immunity. Some other unknowns are duration of immunity. So these vaccines have only been in humans for about 10 months, sorry. So we can only really evaluate the duration of immunity from, for at least 10 months. So we don't know if we're going to have to vaccinate individuals once a year, if the variants of concern are going to make it such that we're going to have to revise our vaccines in the way we do for influenza virus. So there are a lot of unknowns. The other issue is that most of our vaccines right now they prevent disease, but they do not necessarily prevent transmission. Obviously, they lower the viral titers in the lungs, but all of these vaccines that are in use now are delivered intramuscularly. And it is well known that intramuscular administration does not induce very robust mucosal immunity in the upper respiratory tract. It does in the lower respiratory tract, but not the upper respiratory tract. And so new second generation vaccines, you'll see that a lot of people are aiming to deliver intranasally with the goal of trying to induce mucosal immunity to potentially induce sterilizing immunity, or at least to prevent transmission. We may need to alter our vaccines also and tailor these vaccines to the elderly. They don't respond well to vaccination in general, and so you may need to use a different vaccine platform that's more potent, induces a better interferon response to try and overcome the fact that their immune systems are somewhat senescent. So in the interest of time, I'm going to leave it there, and I guess we can talk about variants of concern and vaccine platforms and whatever else people want to talk about.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and everyone. Those were fantastic presentations, really different information, but I see a very common set of issues that we can be talking about. So I've been frantically copying and pasting and typing questions this whole time because I think there's been a huge interest in a variety of these aspects. So do you mind if I go first, Sophie, just because I've got this giant long list?
Go right ahead.
Yes. All right. So I kind of want to start it. Sorry?
It's hard to choose. There's so many that I want to ask. So go.
Yeah. So I'm going to kind of go back sort of in chronological order to an extent. And so the idea of getting people to accept and act on scientific information. So whether it's vaccines or climate change or you name it. I think the idea of the old deficit model, which is people just don't understand enough science. So if we teach them more science, they'll be more accepting. It's pretty well established, as you've noted, that that's not really an effective approach. So it has to do with trust. And I guess the question I have is sort of maybe two parts. One is it an issue not so much about understanding the products of science, so the results of science, as it is the process of science? Is there something about not knowing how vaccines are designed and approved rather than how vaccines work, for example, that's the issue? Is it about understanding the process of science? And I guess, and the second part to that, which I'll happy to repeat if we lose sight of it, is, have we learned anything about how to do this effectively through this pandemic that in ways that might translate to future discussions about climate change, for example? Have we gotten better at it through this experience in actually conveying the information that matters? So do you think it's all this, the trust issues aside, which I think that there were a lot of questions about, but is there something to be said about not explaining the results of science, but the process of science? Is that something that is potentially effective? And have we learned how to do that better? Andrew, I don't know if you wanted to jump in first and then.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me give a sort of maybe a kind of aggressive answer to your question in a sense, right? So this is overly simplistic, but I guess I want to start by saying I don't think it is to do with understanding the process of vaccine development at all, right? So I don't think it's to do with people's understanding of how science works or how vaccines work, because I think most people just don't, right? Generally speaking, we don't trust technologies because we understand how they were developed, how they were manufactured, how they work. We trust them for other reasons. So really, I think fundamentally what the issue is something like the place of those scientific processes in our society, right? So it's not the details of them, it's who controls them, where the money comes from, right? Who benefits from them. So those are the things that I think cause mistrust, right? So I think this is confused. Like, I think this becomes conflated by the fact that once people start to distrust a particular source, then they look around for other sources, right? And then they'll go on the internet and they'll see all this stuff about how mRNA, changes your DNA code, and they'll start to say, that's the reason I don't trust it. But really, that's a side effect of the fact that they don't trust people in white lab coats from the government who tell them that this is good for them. Right. So I think that it's do scientists act in the public interest? Are scientists genuinely doing their best? Are they genuinely neutral and objective? Or are they doing things that will make biotech companies more money? Or are they doing things that will protect the privileges of comfortable communities who would just like, the frontline Amazon delivery guys to get vaccinated? Because it's good for them, right? So I think those are the questions, and I think that is. I mean, I would love to know more about this, think more about this. I think that is generalizable to, for example, climate change denial, right? It's not so much that they don't understand greenhouse gases and so on. It's that they think that it's in somebody's interest to have a particular narrative, and they're suspicious of that. Sometimes for good reasons, sometimes not. Maybe the last thing I'll say is that, to me, one of the crucial things to do is to try and separate out the good reasons from the bad reasons, right? So if you're thinking about social injustice in the context of health, for example, some of that really does exist, right? I think there really are things that we might be starting to do even around vaccination, right? It might just be easier for middle-class people to take time off work to get the vaccine and to deal with the side effects if they have them than for somebody else, right? So maybe somebody who's a single parent and et cetera, right? So those are things that the actual issues that in good faith we should fix. And then there's a bunch of other stuff which really is, I think, a misunderstanding, maybe because that's where I'm coming from. I trust the guys in the white coats, the gals in the white coats, people in the white coats. So then it's a misunderstanding. It's the biotech companies aren't profiting off pandemics, right? It really is of social value. So then I think Kieran made an excellent point, right? And I will just turn it over to Kieran. That's a much trickier conversation. You can't just have the same people saying the same things over and again to try and remove that distrust, even though it doesn't have a reasonable basis.
So I actually want to modify the second part of my question based on your answer, which I think is right on. But have we made it worse then? So if the issue is, perception of inequities in delivery or access, that some are benefiting more, it's hard not to notice, for example, that through the pandemic, the richest people in the world got vastly richer. That the people who are bearing the brunt of the economic fallout are not the 1%ers, right? And that the rollout of vaccines is uneven, both internationally and within communities. So have we kind of proven the point to some extent? Like, have we not sufficiently thought about trust and grappling with those inequities and kind of reinforced some of those concerns? Rather than what I was sort of hoping was the case, was that we've gotten better at this. Maybe we've just made it worse in some ways. So, I mean, do you have a projection on where we'll be with trust in science after all of this? Is it going to be worse than it was?
Yeah, I think that's a genuine concern. I mean, I guess I'm by nature a relatively optimistic kind of a fella. I mean, I think that if you're going to have to grapple with these issues globally, a pandemic is a great opportunity to do that, right? Because it seems like it should be easier to make the case that we're all in this together. Really, it's not the case that Pfizer is doing this in order to make a massive profit, though maybe I'm wrong about that, right? But they're doing that because this is a crisis we're all trying to face. So maybe the trust threshold is lower, and then maybe this will help when we talk about climate change, or we talk about infant vaccination, or other kinds of similar issues.
Kieran, did you want to weigh in a little bit on that too, or?
Sure. Yeah, I think, so let me start by saying that my impression from, the research I've seen is that on the whole in Canada, we have fairly high trust in scientists, relatively. So I think, maybe like starting from there as a kind of a baseline. The other thing is when sort of looking at, why people trust and mistrust, I very consciously use the word public. So I avoid very much talking about the public, because it gives this impression that there's this homogeneous body that has opinions and thoughts like a person, and that's just not the case. The publics are very heterogeneous and diverse, and different communities have very different kind of relationships with government, healthcare, and so on. So I think it's difficult to kind of like sort of blanket state, where all this things is going to go. But one thing I maybe want to comment on is the sort of distinction between, science as outcome and science as process. And I think I'm going to make all the natural scientists in the room very angry now by saying this, but I think often scientists kind of get away with playing the rhetoric on this, because when criticized but you said this and it was wrong, and you're a scientist, very often science will come back and say, but science is a process. It's not an outcome. It's a process, and of course things can improve. But then the thing is, of course, you can say that that's true. But the point is that very often scientists do talk about science as an outcome. It's like, because when challenged on well, how do you know that's true? It's like, because I'm a scientist. I've done the science. So scientists themselves typically talk about science as outcome and only revert to science as process when under pressure to account for failures of science. And I think this, I don't know how big a part of the problem this is or not, but I do think it is a part of the problem, because science is therefore portrayed as something pure and pristine, as a mechanism to get at the truth. And of course, science is fantastic. I mean, it's given us so much, but it is a social process. Moses didn't come down with the tablets of, here is the scientific method. Right? It's a social process. And in fact, sociologists of science have gone into all these labs, and there is no one scientific method. So I think that, because it's presented as pure and pristine, and this is where, then when somebody leaks the emails from the climate change, then it's like, well, oh my God, it's not like, it's biased, right? So it's kind of setting itself up for failure when we point to these flaws. And when it comes to vaccination, I think there's a particular problem in how public health portrays, the key points that public health advocates will always say: vaccines are safe, vaccines are effective. Those are the two, and they pump it. And all you have to say, but there've been very serious side effects to vaccination. People have died. But they are safe, they are effective, nothing to see here. That's just not a good way to get people to trust you.
Have we got examples where an effective approach has been taken, not necessarily vaccines, but something where that trust has been, I think, as you both aptly put it, deserved and earned, where it's been communicated, for example, in a very different way, from trust us, this is safe and effective, or firing off a bunch of statistics or something, but rather there's been a different approach that's been effective. Have we got a model for how to do that you can think of offhand?
Yeah, I do think there are many examples. One that just kind of jumps to mind is a project by some geneticists and genomicists in Alaska, working with indigenous communities who some were doing some very basic genomics work, and some more applied, and they wanted to. But they were working with a lot of indigenous groups for samples and so on, and also particular conditions in those communities. And they engaged in a very comprehensive community engagement process that began with actually having two different Indigenous advisory groups, one from more urban regions and one more from more remote regions, who kind of acted as intermediaries for all of these processes, and then very detailed dialogues to even find out how would you even translate the word genetics into some of the local languages, and to find out there is no concept that works, and to kind of try and start really from the ground up. How do you build communication about the science that is relevant to the communities? I think that worked very well.
That touches on the point about no single public either, that there's different avenues to building those relationships. I won't keep talking. I'll hand it to Sophie if you have a question. But those are great responses, a lot to think about.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I won't talk about trust because we've talked about it. I'll talk later, but it was just huge insight that public health relies on public trust and is so much about public trust. But I'm going to pick up on a question from Teresa, who asked about, Teresa's curious about the vaccine that you are developing, Sarah and Leo, and the plans going forward, and whether it's going to be brought about to the market for humans or animals. And I will tag on my own question, and I apologize if it's evident for a lot of people on tonight, but I have been wondering about the role of universities versus and with industry in vaccine development. And so how does that work? Because we're talking about big pharma and big companies, but you are doing your work in a university. So do you work with an industry? I guess I could go on to explain it, but I actually don't know anything about that, that part of science. And so I'm very curious, because all of these vaccines are coming out of big manufacturers, not university for production, right? So have universities been heavily involved in the development of vaccines to date, and in what ways? But yeah, your own vaccine too, and your own story. So wants to know, and I think it's a good question.
Do you, Leo, I mean, I can maybe talk about the latter part, maybe Leo, you can talk about the vaccine, but one of the issues for us is that we haven't secured our intellectual property yet. And so without IP in place, investors and venture capitalists, they're not really willing to invest in you because there's no guarantee that they will be able to have rights to this vaccine. And so I think it really falls, in this situation, really falls upon the government to fund it. And I think we were a little bit late to the party. I mean, we actually had our vaccine made very quickly. We've tested it in hamsters and non-human primates, but I think we just, we're academics and we weren't thinking like, we should be talking to politicians. We should be getting money, because I won't name names, but I know that there are companies that I've worked with, I've supplied certain reagents to. We are so far ahead of them in terms of what our efficacy studies, but they were talking to the government, they were talking to the right people, they got the funding. So I think a lot of it is promotion, and we don't know how to do that. And, next time around, I think, Leo, don't you think we will know how to promote better next time? But we were just so concerned about doing the science that we didn't think about how to advance it.
Yeah, that was an eye-opener for me as well. That is obviously visibility is very important, how to basically get funded in a way that is not just about, grant writing as we're usually used to. So like getting the right contact and, getting funds ultimately from private companies. So I think that getting fundings from the private company, it's very important. So either you get money from private company or you get money from the government. I think it's very difficult from the university to have a product development pipeline to bring this type of vaccines to the market. I think that the way the partnership work is that, the university do have the part of the intellectual property, or they have like the prototype, and then this eventually is developed through methods that are not really easily applicable. They cannot really be applied in the university. I mean, we have research program, we do have students, right? We have to have students graduate, like just the way academia is set up is not very conducive to then eventually have a large scale production because of people, because of resources, infrastructures. So I think that these partnerships are necessary. So yeah, I would say, Sarah, I don't know if you
Yep,
agree.
no,
but
I completely agree.
That's where we are at right now with our
So-
so I guess now we have this philosophical decision. I mean, we are going to work on it for the sake of gathering additional information as a scientific endeavor, as long as it will become eventually manufactured, that we're still waiting on a few things. So once we have, if you can secure the IP, intellectual property rights, as we want to, then eventually we can find somebody to sponsor us to move on into the clinical into the clinical trials, which are very expensive. So we will need money for that.
And I do want to state, though, that the university has been very supportive. So they are filing a patent. It's just that we didn't have that patent in place at the time when money was flowing and people were looking for vaccines. We sort of missed the boat at that point.
So that's super interesting to me that you say next time. So I don't know if is your story, and you might not know this. Is it one of a kind, or do you know that there's other academics in universities that have had? And then I guess the next question for me is, when you say next time we'll know better. So so this is like obviously for you, but are you seeing that maybe university and research in universities might actually change a bit as a result of what we've learned during COVID in terms of how we get our discoveries and our research out to industry and to discuss with the government and to get all of that stuff sorted?
I think one thing I would say is, I mean, we early on were working with the National Research Council, but one of the issues that I mentioned is that they didn't have the capacity to make GMP grade vaccine. So as much as they have the know-how and the infrastructure, they weren't able to do it. But we'll be in a different situation in a year's time where they can actually make it. So I think maybe there'll be more of an interaction between academia and government, because that is a government agency. What do you think, Leo?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this pandemic has taught us a lot, and if has taught us anything, is that there should be probably a more streamlined way to be for preparedness. I mean, granted, this vaccine have been produced in basically a year and some change, so it still has been very fast. But I think that if we have to implement a way to streamline the regulatory kind of efforts that need to be done, that has to come basically from the government. That is the government that has to decide what to do. So, some of the countries that have most access to vaccine, or some of the countries that were able to have the vaccine fastest, are countries that have either production center in their soil, like for example, the United States, even though they're private, but they have done the Operation Warp Speed, so they have actually put a lot of money into this production, or countries that have nationalized production systems, such as Russia and China. So when push comes to shove, having the ability of producing your own vaccine through a national system is very important. And if that doesn't happen, then I guess that you have to find a way to maybe change the way the regulatory body, so to make it limber, so that it can be deployed in a faster way. And that shouldn't go against the assessing safety, as it has been done before. Like phase 3 clinical trial have been done, probably bigger than some phase 3 clinical trial that have been for other vaccines, for these vaccines, but they have been done at the same times. And that, so all of the regulatory steps have been met. They're just being compressed of met in a shorter period of time, which is something that sometimes people do not appreciate, because it has been done so fast, whereas usually it takes 10 years to make a vaccine. That is true, but that doesn't mean that the same checkpoints haven't been met. And also it can take a very long time to produce these vaccines, but like when a lot of these efforts are concentrated just on one pathogen, then you can make it happen. So it's not that it is impossible, that it's not, it is possible definitely to deploy it in a shorter period of time.
And the one other thing I just wanted to add quickly is that this really isn't a concern for this pandemic, but if we look at the SARS epidemic or the SARS outbreak, and then Zika virus, for example. So, the money dried up. There were a lot of people who were developing vaccines, but then SARS went away. Zika is not really an issue anymore. I mean, there are other issues, because we don't have a lot of, we couldn't test SARS during an outbreak because we just don't have any human cases. Similarly with Zika, we've, thankfully run out of people that the virus isn't really circulating to the point where we could run a clinical trial. But it doesn't mean that we should stop investment in those vaccines. Like the government should continue to invest in those vaccines, get them through to the end, do the farm talks so that should this happen again, we can hit the ground running. So that's another plug for more money for vaccine development.
Super interesting. Thank you so much, Ryan.
Yeah, so I actually had something that came to mind as you were discussing, Sarah and Leo, about your particular vaccine, which is a nasal one, and it's also true for some of the seasonal flu vaccines, right? There's both a shot and then there's the inhaled version, and I guess it made me wonder a little bit about the degree to which mode of delivery affects people's comfort level or sense of trust with a treatment. So, and this might be for everyone. But for example, I was thinking, if you had, let's say you had a Flintstone vitamin sort of vaccine that's a chewable, tastes like fruit, would you have a much higher uptake than something that's injected, which is just sort of by its nature, it's seen as invasive? Or if you had something where, basically you could spray a room and everybody, there is going to inhale it and confer some defense. We're all pretty comfortable with sort of external, the hand sanitizers and that sort of thing. I think in some ways the injection is kind of something, I don't even mean the phobias of needles, but just the notion of an injection kind of strikes people a certain way. So do you think that's something else too? Is should there be more thought about, I don't know, less disconcerting modes of delivery maybe as another mechanism that would gain people's comfort level in some way? Or do you see, is there extra demand for that wherever it's possible to do a vaccine in, say, an inhaled version rather than injection?
Yeah, I can take that one.
Sure.
I think there's definitely evidence for that. One of Megan McMurtry, a colleague in the psychology department, works on needle fear. Mm-hmm. And I think the estimates are that of all kind of vaccine hesitancy, probably about 10% is attributable to some kind of needle fear, some variation thereof. I think, how exactly does this operate? It probably varies with people. Sometimes maybe a phobia. Sometimes also with childhood vaccination, it's, the prospect of taking your child. And even if you think that, the needle's fine, just the idea that they'll be screaming and these things. So I don't think they're necessarily sort of like, as a result of this, I don't trust, but it certainly, like, it creates a certain kind of barrier. It's not an equity barrier. It's not a financial barrier, but it nevertheless introduces. I think, I don't think this is going to be like it's not going to be like a complete watershed, but I definitely think it's a contributor.
I mean, I would add that, yes, for sure, like needle-free delivery, is going to be more accepted. Like a squirt in the nose also is going to be probably better accepted than an injection. However, it's also true that, the delivery, meets the hard needs of developing an immune response. So, for example, polio vaccine could have been delivered as a drop. Polio is it's something that can be transmitted by oral-fecal transmission, so it's just as natural routes of infection. But when you think about a respiratory infection, I guess you can try and do the intranasal or the aerosol. But for a lot of other vaccine, for example, still parenteral administration, which is basically a shot, subcutaneous and intramuscular, are the way to go. So you cannot meet the necessity of the biology of the virus, and at the same time also the feasibility. So, like it's not very easy, for example, to go and get your shot at the doctor when he has to reconstitute a lyophilized virus and then put it in some sort of aerosol system, deliver it to the patient, and make sure that the reminder of this aerosol, because you're not in an airtight system, right? I mean, there is every time we do aerosol, some of the aerosolized media is dispersed in the room, right? So let's say this doctor has to do a certain amount of vaccination. How much of that residual amount is indeed present? So there are some technical issues associated with that also have to be, and manufacturing that have to be taken into consideration.
Sophie?
Yeah, okay, because we're getting towards the end, so I'm going to actually try to ask a question that probably incorporates 10 questions in the chat. And if I look worried, it's because I haven't thought it through completely. But okay, I'm going to try. So I think the question is about where are we going? Because as you were doing all of your presentations, it just occurred to me, also because I'm really thinking about how, like, when we're going to like a place without masks, all that kind of stuff. It really feels like some of the deployment that is going to happen over the next few months really needs to be right. And there's so many questions about second doses of vaccines that were in the chat tonight. I was trying to get all the names, but I gave up. And in particular, I guess there was somebody, I can't remember who, but talked about administratively, if we want people to get the same doses of the same vaccine as the second dose, it's a nightmare. It's even hard to organize second doses together, like administratively. So it seems like there's a lot of opportunities for things to go really not to go super well in terms of how it's gonna happen. And if we're saying trust is really important, and that we need to keep trust, and hopefully, 2 years from now, there's more trust in public health, not less, right? That would be really, really bad if we are 2 years from now and there's even less trust in public health, right? So I guess, like, what are the ways in which are you hopeful? Are you worried? What could help? And this is also tying up to questions earlier in the chat around fake news, around some politicians around the world talking about COVID-19 as a hoax, around the power of social media and influencers as opposed to more traditional type of news media. So we know all of these things are happening. We know we're existing. This is where, like, I'm like, oh my gosh, where's my question? All of these things, and we're existing in this sphere, right? Where there's social media, is all that kind of stuff. There's fake news, there's like talk of hoax. And we also know that the next few months, we're gonna start to talk about more vaccinations, second doses. So where are we going? Is it likely a good place? Are you really confident about the deployment of the vaccine in the summer, and it's tying up to Crystal and school in the fall? And so, or are you really worried? Whew, I think I did it. I think I have a question in there.
You're muted, Sarah.
Has to happen, right? I was just going to comment on the dosing intervals, and this is probably territory we shouldn't go into, but I think that also has to do with trust. So the dosing intervals for the mRNA vaccines are 21 and 28 days. I can't remember for the Moderna or Pfizer, but either way, they're defined. And Canada has elected, or public health officials have decided, to move from the prescribed 21 to 28 dose interval to 4 months. And as it stands right now, and at least according to me, and things change every day, there's no evidence to suggest that there's no evidence to suggest that the vaccine efficacy will be the same. So there's no evidence to suggest that it won't be. But we do know that if you vaccinate 21 days after the initial dose, there's 95% efficacy. And I think, and there are studies coming out to show that if you do single doses or delay dosing in cancer patients, their efficacy goes from 95% to something like 45%. This is also a brand new vaccine platform that has never been evaluated in humans, and I'm concerned about modifying or deviating from a protocol that we know works and is extremely experimental. So I'm very disappointed in, I shouldn't say that, I'm disappointed in the way the vaccine rollout has been adjusted. And I understand we have vaccine shortages, but I guess maybe a more targeted approach to say, okay, well, we're going to vaccinate the elderly properly. We're going to do it in the right interval. And then, younger people, we know they're not dying from COVID-19 in any great numbers. So, but also this comes to the trust. So I think that if the government and the public health officials had just communicated this to the Canadian public and just talked to them frankly, like, look, we don't have manufacturing capacity in this country. We're sorry, we're trying to fix it, but we are begging for vaccines and this is what we're getting. And our approach is to do this, but I do think that a lot of people would say, well, let's vaccinate the most vulnerable with the appropriate schedule and we'll figure out the rest. I don't know. That would be my approach, but I'm going to leave it there and let's see what other people have to say.
I wanted to jump in on that too and just say that, I think we've all learned quite a lot about communication during a crisis at many, many levels and how important it is that it be open and frank and, realistic, not overly optimistic or promising things that can't actually be promised. And I agree with you. So if someone says it's just fine to do it 4 months, no problem, it's going to be great. That I think at this point people see those kinds of proclamations as eroding trust, not making people more confident. I think, and then we've seen that sort of over and over and over again. So it's a really important point that I think you have to give them more credit for being able to handle uncertainty and to be able to navigate, a rapidly changing situation. But these proclamations, like, it'll be fine, we're going to do this. I think that backfires badly. So I'm glad you kind of mentioned that example. It's very important. Did anyone else want to weigh in on that question? Actually, before we've only got a little bit of time. All right, so I'm going to go with my sort of go-to question, which I like to use at the end, which is to think about some things. We've asked this in a few different ways, but it has to do with your personal experience with the pandemic. So are there things that you are particularly looking forward to when things change back to a little more normal? And are there things you hope don't go back to the way they were? I'm guessing there's some lessons learned about research, for example. But we always like to kind of have that personal connection. So we've each got example of something that you miss and want back, and something you hope does not return to the way it was. I'm very interested in hearing what you each think of that. So you're on my screen at the moment, so maybe I'll throw it to you first. Yeah.
Well, I can talk a lot about the things I miss. I mean, I'm looking forward to just being able to interact with humans in the way that I'm used to interacting with them. I miss my family. I miss my friends. I miss lab meetings in person. I miss going to conferences. I just miss seeing people in person. So I'm very much looking forward to getting back to that aspect of normal life. Good things. I mean, we were highly productive in the lab. So I think, an epidemic or a pandemic really motivates people. We're a little burnt out, but I'm really impressed by our group and Leo's group and all of our collaborators who've been able to just mobilize really quickly and do some really good science. So I do love that.
Thank you for all your work on that too, by the way. That's something we're all grateful for, everyone who stepped up to work on solutions. Leo?
Yeah, very similar, definitely human contact, both socially, in private with friends, but also at work, is becoming really tolling, every time to talk to people through internet. I don't know you guys, but it just, this meeting that are just not quite the same. Sometimes you have spur of the moment discussion, if you're in the hallway, you meet somebody, you catch up, and this is something you can do. And also I feel like the mentoring with students, like when it's done through the screen, it is not just the same than in person or lab meeting. So that's one thing. Being able to travel. So I haven't been home for now almost 2 years. I'm originally from Italy. So yeah, I mean, I would like to go back and visit. And Italy actually was hit pretty hard. Like thankfully, my mom, who's 73, she's fine, but definitely it was a scare. And she's actually getting the AstraZeneca vaccine. So I've seen somebody had asked a question if I was concerned, and my mom asked that. I said that she should do it because there is really no evidence that it causes side effects. But yeah, so these are some of the things that, family and so really in every aspect of life, really. And honestly, one last thing that I would miss, which I don't know if it will ever happen again, is to actually not being bombarded every day with news about COVID-19. I feel like that I am over the threshold. Any news is absolutely saturated with sort of information about COVID-19. And there is like some sort of like schizophrenia, like there's so many news. No wonder people that, don't necessarily know technically how vaccine works, they get scared because there is just so much information, press conference or this conference, and I get it. We have to be transparent to show, to maintain trust. But at the same time, I think that there is such a thing as an excess of information, especially because this information are just hearsay. A lot of these things are not based on necessarily like demonstrated things. And so I feel like that, I understand why we need to talk about it. I understand why, the news outlet, they talk about it. But, for example, at the beginning when I was following the outbreak as it happened in Italy, one of the first countries to be affected, and they still do that on a daily basis, they give the amount of new cases and the amount of dead people that have been on every day. And I'm not sure what is exactly the point of this kind of somewhat morbid detail. We don't really know really a lot of these people, what is the ultimate or the proximate cause of that. Somebody might have had COVID, but maybe died of heart attack. So, So, this is something that we need to think about. And also, I don't want to say that we shouldn't talk about it. So I guess somebody else more qualified than me can answer that. But that is something that I found particularly telling.
We had, so just as a really quick anecdote about this course, there was some, when we were first thinking about it, there was some question of, are students sick of hearing about COVID? And I think the response we had was that they're sick of hearing about the same thing about COVID every day. But
I was mostly talking about news.
And that's what I mean.
I was
so
not
when
really
you're getting
talking about
bombarded,
you're working on a vaccine, so if I didn't want to hear about it.
yeah, no, and that's what I mean is that I'm, it gets to be overwhelming with the same things, the same kind of news. And what we wanted to do is really kind of explore it from these different perspectives. And that's much more interesting, I think, we've found. And you have to dive in and ask different people with different expertise. But you're right, it's just this constant barrage of the same stuff, and mostly not very information dense, right? Like it's a lot of the same speculation and stuff like that. Kieran?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think one of the things I'm looking forward to is getting away from, like, everything is channeled. As academics, we're already in front of our computers all the time. And now even more is just channeled to the screen. Like, so much of my life comes into that screen, and it's exhausting. And I'm very much looking forward to getting away from that. I like Leo. I want to go back to travel, and I want to go to conferences. I want to sit with colleagues from other parts of the world in the same room and talk about things other than COVID. Mm-hmm. I'm very much looking forward to that. One thing I'll miss is I've really enjoyed pandemic humor. Like, some of it's just been like really funny. And and I think that also speaks to kind of the human spirit of, in adversity, this is the kind of stuff that gets us through.
Andrew.
Yeah, what they said. I'm really
right
to get back to a globally connected world again and travel again. So I think that's why it's important not to think of this as a sequence of national epidemics, but genuinely global pandemic needing a global response. And in terms of what I think we want to hang on to. I mean, I think we found a lot of different ways of doing things. There's a lot of flexibility, particularly around work, but also around how we spend time with our families, maybe more in the outdoors than going to movie theaters, for example. And I think we found that some of that doesn't work that great. I totally want to be back with my colleagues in person and my friends and family in person, but some of it does. So I think we've learned some lessons there, which I hope we can hang on to. Excellent.
Well, thank you all so much for a phenomenal panel. So informative, so thought-provoking, and it's being echoed in the chat as well.
Yeah.
We did not get anywhere close to covering all the questions, but really fascinating. Really appreciate everything you've all been doing. It was a great discussion. We'll Colin, if you have the slides for next week, just to kind of remind everybody. So next week, we're going to be talking about adaptation and resilience in communities. Really interesting pair of panelists for next time. Ajay Hebel from the English and Theater Studies Department and Carla Rice from Family Relations and Applied Nutrition. Should be a very interesting discussion, as always. Sophie, did you want to say anything else to wrap up?
No, I'll just say thank you so much to our guest panelists tonight. This was awesome. I agree with everyone in the chat, and thank you to everyone in the chat as always for all these fantastic questions. And sorry we didn't get to most of them, but I think it was a great evening regardless. And I'm thrilled that you were able to join us. And for the class, see you next week.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank you
having
very
us.
much, Sophie and
Bye.
Ryan. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.